So in this lesson, we're going to talk about cloth in ZBrush 2021. And I'm going to use demos built around this image here. This is most of what you see on screen here was accomplished using cloth. I used the cloth dynamics to create this veil and micropoly to create the lace structure here. I used cloth with inflate to create the pillow, and I used cloth to create the table spread here. Even the flowers were created using the transpose cloth brush and collision objects to create those petals and make them sort of bend around one another. So let's take a look at how we do cloth inside of ZBrush 2021. So I've got just a little, almost like an obstacle course set up here of just some primitives that we're going to use as a demonstration to drape some cloth objects over. Now, the number one thing when you're working with cloth dynamics in ZBrush, let's tear the menu off and drop it on the side of the screen here. You need to make sure under your subtool, or excuse me, under your geometry menu, under the size menu, you want to make sure that your size is 2 XYZ units. This is your ZBrush internal scale. And we talk about this in the chapter early on Scale Master. This is the ideal scale that the algorithm will actually work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Z plugin. I'm going to go to Scale Master and just click ZBrush Scale Unify. And now you see that that is set to 2 brush units, and that's for everything. Now I'm going to go to my subtool menu and I'm going to append in a polymesh star. Make sure that that is selected. Go to the gizmo, press the gear, turn this into a polyplane, and we'll just move this up and then rotate it 90 degrees. And then I will scale that up like so. Just want to make sure that I've got enough coverage that it'll drape over everything. Now we'll go back down here and go to geometry, size, and you see that we are 1.59, so that's all right. Let's just go back to Z plugin and scale unify again, just to make sure. There we go. Now we're 1.5. Good. So that's the value that ZBrush is ideally going to give us. So as long as ZBrush has checked that scale, we should be fine. So I want to give this cloth some thickness because you can see it doesn't exist except as a 2D plane. So we're going to do this by going to dynamic subdivisions, and this has a knock-on effect where dynamic subdivisions are not as heavy in the memory overhead, so the algorithm can run a little bit faster on them. So if I take this thickness slider and turn this up, I can give this cloth a little bit of thickness, as you can see here. Maybe that's a little too thick. Let's just dial that back just a tick. There we go. Now I can adjust my subdivisions here, my smooth subdivs, set it to maybe 2 or 3. And now I'm going to take my transpose, move this down. All right. Bring this over here. And there we go. So now we're ready to run a simulation. So if I were to come over here to my dynamics menu, we're going to leave our settings as they are. Simulation is 100, strength is 1, firmness 2. We're going to allow floor collision, and we're going to leave gravity on. And I'm not going to click anything else. I'm just going to click run simulation, and that's all that happens. The cloth goes down and hits the ground. So why is that? Well, we need to set our first type of collision, or our second, because we have a floor collision turned on. We have 3 different types of collision: floor collision, self-collision, and then collision volumes. All of your other visible subtools are your collision volumes. Now, these should be watertight meshes. You want to avoid having holes in these that can actually mess with the algorithm, so that's just something to keep in mind. What I'll do is I'll turn on collision volume, and it's going to calculate by merging all these volumes together and creating like a proxy volume in memory. We have options here for the resolution, the detail of that proxy in memory, and how inflated it is off the surface of the original. So these can help us fine-tune when we're trying to get the cloth to lay perfectly against a surface. But now that we have a collision volume, if I run simulation, now you see it's actually draping, but it's not really doing all that great. It's kind of flopping on through there, and it's not as good as it could be. So let's undo that. And I am going to take my, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my simulation iterations. I'm going to turn that all the way up to 1,000. Now what that does is it gives me a much more accurate simulation, but it'll take a little bit more time. So we run that, and now you see it's a little bit more accurate, but it's still pretty stiff. So let's undo that. And let's take our gravity strength and turn our gravity strength all the way up, and now run our simulation. So that was probably a little too much gravity strength. We'll turn that down a little bit and run our simulation. So we're still not getting quite what we want in terms of resolution. So I am going to turn off my dynamic subdivisions. I'm just going to put a couple divisions on here and then turn my dynamic back on. We're actually going to delete our lower levels. There we go. And now I will run my simulation. And now it's much more accurate. So what's happening is the resolution of your actual cloth object in conjunction with these settings here, these settings can only do so much if you don't have enough resolution in your object. Right now the object is about 1,000 faces, looks like. Yeah, 1,000, a little over 1,000. So let's undo that. And I'm going to drop my gravity strength a little bit and then run simulation. That slows down the process, and you see that gives me a little bit better result. See, what's happening here is the slower your cloth falls, the more time ZBrush has to use these iterations to run the math to get a more accurate draping. So let's undo this, and let's turn our gravity strength down a little bit. And we can also change our gravity direction just by changing our angle and setting direction, but we're going to stick with it pulling down towards the ground plane. We can also use liquefy gravity, which we'll look at in just a minute. What I want to do is I want to change my firmness. I'm going to turn the firmness down to 1, and that's going to make the cloth not quite so firm. So if I were to run simulation now, you see that we'll get a different character. You can already see we're getting a different character to those wrinkles. They're much finer. There we go. Now we'll stop that simulation just by clicking the button again and zooming in, and you can see the cloth is actually crashing into itself in some of these areas. So that's where we bring in our next collision type, which is self-collision. If I set this to 1, the cloth will start to factor itself into the math. So now if I run that simulation, not only is it going to collide with the rigid bodies within the scene, it's also going to collide with itself. So it will fold over and create, here you can see it happening right there. It creates these nice shapes where before we were kind of getting interpenetrations and weird folds. There, that's a nice one there. Now if I stop my simulation, we can zoom in there and take a look at what we're getting. So it's pretty nice. So let's zoom around and take a look at the other side. So that's a great example right there where the self-collision is allowing it to fold but not interpenetrate. So that's really nice. So let's undo and let's do one more thing here. So we've got our strength set to 1. If we dial the strength back, it's just going to allow the cloth to sort of deform more. If I were to turn this down and then run my simulation, you might find that the cloth seems to stretch or deform a bit more than it was before because it's not forcing it to maintain its original kind of shape. And that's something we want to be aware of, that as you start using your cloth brushes, you can start to lose the actual shape of your cloth. So there's a couple things we can do to take care of that. I am going to turn my strength back up and let's run that simulation one more time, and then we're going to start using some brushes on it. We'll stop the simulation here. So incidentally, you don't have to run the simulation. If you've got these settings set up, you can go to B for brush, C for cloth, and grab a cloth brush. I'll grab cloth pull. And it's set to on brush. So what happens is when I click and drag this mesh, it's going to calculate all these settings based on the points on my brush that are underneath my brush that I'm affecting with my brush. So you see, as I move this cloth around, it's essentially running the cloth simulation. It's just running it on the parts that I'm adjusting with my brush. So if I drag this down, you see what happens there. If I pull this down, See, we didn't even get this all the way down to the ground plane yet, but I can grab these and just pull them right down like this. There we go. Now, as I stretch, you see I can start to stretch that cloth out a bit. So let's undo back to where we were originally. And I'm going to go to Tool, Morph Target, Store Morph Target. And that's just going to store a copy of the mesh in memory. We'll do this again in a later section when we do a veil on top of a skull. We'll talk about it a bit more then, but suffice to say right now, having the morph target stored means it's another way of maintaining the overall shape of this cloth. So let's go ahead and run that simulation again with the gravity strength turned up a little bit. And that drapes right down there. Now, if I take this brush and start to pull, see, I can't stretch the cloth without it pulling the other side, so it's maintaining its volume. And this is really great if you're trying to do a cape or a cloak or something like that. Really, really handy to be able to keep your overall volume. Now, sometimes you can yank something right through a collision object. You just need to grab it, pull it back up. A really good brush for doing that, I find, is the Move Cloth. B for brush, C for cloth. Cloth Move brush is really great for just aggressively pulling the cloth wherever I happen to want it to be. So here, I'm going to grab this, and I'll just pull this down like this. B for brush, C for cloth. We'll grab Cloth Move, and I'll just say, nope, you're coming down here with me. Pull that back, and it's going to slide the rest of the cloth with it. There we go. So if I grab this cloth and pull, the rest of the cloth comes with it. So it's sort of forcing it. Oh, that's a really great fold right there. You know, we're getting this really nice look there. We go to B for brush, C for cloth. We have some other cloth brushes that we can use. There's Cloth Fold. The Cloth Fold does exactly what it says on the tin. It creates a fold. So we can roll that through there and get a nice fold. So I'm just running that along there, running that along here. I might turn up my Z intensity on that. Maybe turn my draw size down a little bit. There we go. And these brushes behave the same way on things that are not cloth objects. You can also use these brushes to sculpt skin. I've seen people use them to sculpt like saggy flesh, like on a hound dog or fantasy creatures. So it's totally valid for that. B for brush, C for cloth. We can also do cloth hook. This is quite an aggressive brush, which is nice for pulling things around. So if I grab this, I can hook the cloth, sort of pull this down like that. And by the way, you can just smooth it. If you run into a problem, it's fine. You can actually smooth this and then just wiggle it, and it will restore its volume again. That's part of the benefit of having that morph target stored. So if I pull these out, let's take that cloth hook and hook these and just pull them up here. There we go. And by the way, I can also mask out an area of the mesh like this, invert that mask, and then I can just run the simulation just on that area. If that area is bugging me and I like the rest, I can do this. End my simulation by clicking that again, and then clear my mask. So the cloth brushes and the cloth tools are quite easy as long as you kind of keep in mind what the settings are for, because they're not that difficult, but they're new. And also your scale. Your scale is the number one thing. And most of the time when I've got students who are having problems with cloth, it always boils down to the fact that their collision object is either has holes in it or their object scale is just way too big. And remember, that's under the size setting here under the geometry menu. So I said that I would show you Liquify. So if I just undo all the way back here, Liquify gravity is kind of neat. It gives you a turbulence. So what that would be is if we, you know, like turbulence, if this were floating through air as it was coming down, you'd have this sort of turbulence effect occurring on the cloth. So if I turn on Liquify and then run my simulation, you see it falls as if it's draping. There we go. And it gives you a real beautiful effect as it falls and gathers. So we'll end that. And then I will just make sure that I've got my B for brush, C for cloth. We'll take maybe cloth pull, and I could pull that cloth. And if you wiggle the cloth, you can sort of add wrinkles to it, like that. Go back to B for brush, C for cloth. My personal favorite is always the cloth pull and the cloth nudge. I find those really, really useful. And there's another couple good ones here. There is the cloth twist. And there we go, cloth twister. This one's a lot of fun, and we use this again in a later chapter, but you can use this to twist the cloth, which is absolutely a valid shape that you would get in a lot of different drapery situations, but not one that would be easy to sort of manually sculpt. So there we go, we can grab this and pull this out. I'll turn this up and just really ball up the whole cloth like that. So you can do something along these lines. And this will be fun. What if we turn our firmness all the way up and then turn off liquefy and run our simulation again? We can make our cloth kind of unfold itself as it falls to the ground. Then we can just take let's do cloth hook, because it's a nice aggressive cloth brush. So cloth hook, we can grab one corner of it and just sort of pull it around. Pull this out here. There we go. Pull it over, and then pull it back up. So we can sort of unfold it and let it sort of fly through the air. This is a great way to create maybe a flag or a cape or a bit of costume that's billowing in the wind. Speaking of, we can mask, like I said, we can mask out portions of it like this, and then take our move brush, and then we can affect just the unmasked areas. So that's really great for creating tails on costume, maybe a coat or a cloak, something like this. It is really quite cool to be able to do that. Now, this is sort of reading more like leather because of the firmness. If I turn this back down to 1, look how different the quality of the wrinkles are. Now, a big thing with drapery, like when you're like sculpting and drawing drapery, they always tell you that you're communicating the type of fabric by the character of the wrinkles. So smaller, finer wrinkles are going to look like silk, and bigger, rougher wrinkles are going to look like more and more coarse fabrics. So that's sort of what we're trying to get across here by adjusting that firmness. So we can go ahead and clear our mask. There we go. So that's the basics of cloth. Let's take a look at a few case studies of how we can actually use this in some interesting ways. This is interesting what we've already done, but let's see some other things that we can do using dynamics and the cloth brushes. So let's take a look at how we can create a pillow like the one we see here using cloth with the inflate modifier. So I'm going to go over to the Polymesh star, and I'm going to select this, turn it into a polyplane. And if we go into frame mode, we can see our resolution. It should be okay for a start. I'm going to go ahead and press the W key just to get out of the generate the primitive little cones there. And I'll just divide this a couple times, maybe one more time. There we go. This gives me about 1,000 faces, and I will scale that up a little bit. And once again, I just want to make sure that my size is accurate. So I'm just going to go to size, make sure that, so this is at 1.6, which is probably going to be fine, but I'm just going to go to Z plugin and go to scale master and just unify my scale just in case. And that brings me up to 1.9, which is absolutely ideal. So that's good. Remember that scale is going to help the algorithm actually be more accurate. And the root of a lot of problems with cloth are because your size is too big or too small. So we'll go to geometry, go to delete lower, and go to dynamic subdivision levels and turn that on. And I'm going to give this some thickness. And we'll give it a little bit more thickness than we might if we were doing just a regular piece of cloth. This is going to be a pillow. Now I've got a segment slider here. I'll turn this up to 3, and you see that gives me a ring that runs through the middle there. And I don't need to add any smooth subdiv, so I'll turn that down. And I'll go ahead and click apply. So now I've applied this as actual geometry. Now what I want to do is I want to polygroup this poly loop that runs down the center of the two halves. So I'll go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and select the Z modeler brush. Just skip that note. Mouse over a face and press the space bar. I want to polygroup based on polyloop. And then when I mouse over this, I get this orange line, and I'm just going to click. And if I press the Alt key, it will actually give me a new polygroup. So let's do this again. There we go. So I can just get a nice contrasting color there so it's easy to see. Now we'll leave the Z Modeler brush, and I am going to Control-Shift-Click to hide these polygroups. Now, back faces are not turned on, so we'll go down to Tool, Display Properties, and turn on double-sided so it's easier to see what we're actually doing here. So now I've isolated just this ring. I'm going to mask it, invert my visibility. I'm going to go to Polygroups and just group visible. And that's going to make it easier just to isolate that piece anytime I need it. So I've got the two outer faces unmasked and the center ring masked. So let's go to the Dynamics menu here. Now I don't need gravity and I don't need floor collision. I'm going to turn the floor on. Now you see the floor is actually halfway through my object, so I'm just going to take the transpose line and move that up. I'll need to clear my mask to do that, so let's clear the mask and move that up. And then I will Control-Shift-Click to hide those other polygroups, mask that, and there we go. So now I'm going to make sure gravity is turned off, and I am going to turn my inflate on, and we'll raise the value just a little bit and click Run Simulation, and that will inflate that object like so. So let's go ahead and check that. I think that's a good size there. I'm going to go ahead and clear my mask now. And I might add a dynamic subdivision level to this. So let's say yes. Just want to make sure that I can get a little bit better result. Or I could just add a regular old subdivision level just by Control-D. Now I'm going to turn on floor collision. What I'm going to do is instead of actually running a simulation and bouncing this off the floor, I'm going to go to B for brush, T for transpose, and use transpose cloth. Now transpose cloth allows me to manipulate a cloth object and do things like this. As I move it, it continues to apply this inflate. If I turn that off and then move it, the only thing that it can impact or affect is the floor collision. So if I bring it down here, boom, I can bump it against the floor, and I can start to add these nice little compression folds where this has come into contact with the ground like this. And really, I could divide that again. I think I'd get away with some better sort of result from that. I'm just going to take this and just boom, tuck that down, and I'll just bump the corner like that. You see what that does? It just gives me a nice little puckering in that corner. And we'll do the same thing over here. I'm just going to rotate this and bring this down like that. And then bring it down so it's making contact with the ground. And that's really great because that gives us these wrinkles here, these nice compression wrinkles where it feels like that floor is compressing that pillow up where it's making contact there. Now, I mean, if I divide it again, these could become even more fine, but it's also going to considerably slow down the effect of my brush. So I'm going to undo that. Go to my geometry menu. We've got two subdivs now. If I delete those lower subdivision levels and then just add a dynamic subdivision level, make sure that our thickness is turned down to 0. There we go. Now, if we do the same thing, you see that we start to get, let's turn off frame mode so we can see things a little bit better. Now we start to get some more of those wrinkles, but they're not quite as sort of ugly and slow as the ones we had before. So I'm going to undo this because I don't really like what I've got on this edge right there, and I'm just going to very gently bump this down. So if I take this, bring it down, I can take my simulation iterations and turn that up, and I can turn my firmness up as well, so the pillow is a lot more firm. And now if I bump that into the floor, you see what we get. It's a lot more like what we might expect a pillow to be, or a cushion. So if we bring this and set it off center a little bit, bring this down, doop, 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 and bump, bump, bump. There we go. We get a nice little curve to that, like so. And you see, as I'm doing that, it's trying to reintroduce the original shape because I've got that firmness up so high. If I turn the firmness down maybe to 3, do the same movement, you see it's not going to do quite so much reintroducing of that shape. So let's go ahead and turn on self-collision. And then we'll just go ahead and bump this along and get that nice compression where this pillow is sitting against the ground. Now I want something to sit on the pillow. So I want there to be something else affecting the surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my skull in. So let's go to the other object here. And let's go to the skull, and I'm going to merge down, always okay. Merge down. So that skull is just one object, and now we'll go back to that pillow, append it in as a subtool, like so. So the pillow, or the skull, is sitting way up here, as you see. So I'm just going to take it and go to deformation, unify. And that'll bring it right down there to the origin. And I'm just going to bring this up. Now, I am on my cloth transpose, so I need to be careful of that. So you see it says simulation skipped. I'm going to scale this down. We're going to go to B for brush, T for transpose, and change this to just the regular transpose. There we go. We'll scale that skull down, like so. Okay, so I'm going to orient the skull like this. Now I'm going to select the pillow, B for brush, T for transpose, and do transpose cloth. Oops, I missed it. B for brush, T for transpose, transpose cloth. And now if I bring this up, nothing's going to happen yet because we need a rigid body. So let's go ahead and turn on collision volume, and ZBrush is going to calculate the volume with that skull in there. Now the skull is a collision object, so if I take my pillow and just bump it up there, the skull does this, which I just can't get over how cool this is. It compresses the pillow as if it's laying on it. I can just really push that in and really compress that so it looks like it's just sitting in this nice big soft cushion. And I can step up, if I have a subdivision level to step up to, I can step up a subdiv. I can go to B for brush, C for cloth, and we can do something like, let's just grab the cloth pull, and I can start to adjust the wrinkles that we're getting on the surface of this cushion just by using this brush. I'm going to go ahead and smooth this a little bit. There we go. Now if I wanted to run a stroke along here, there's a really great brush, B for brush, C for cloth, and there's a couple. There's cloth dimple, and there is a cloth pinch trails, which can be quite cool. So we take this and run this along here. We can get a nice sort of puckered seam, but we want to make sure we turn that down a little bit. We might need to turn down our Z intensity and run that along there like this. And I can replay that stroke, or I can just increase my Z intensity on the brush so it's a little bit stronger. There we go. So we can get a nice sort of puckering there. It's still not quite right. Let's turn that brush size down. I'm going to turn off my dynamic subdivisions. There we go. And I'm going to just add another subdiv. There we go. So I run this puckered stroke along here, and it gives me this sort of puckering seam like you might get along the edge of a pillow or a cushion. Run it along here. And there you see we get the same kind of look right up to that point there. Shoop. So it just gives us this real nice puckering right there. I'll turn this up and you can probably see it even more. There you go. That might be a little bit clearer with a larger brush size. I'll just bring it from here. Actually, I don't want to go from that direction. I'll bring it from here over. There you go. You can see what this gives us. And I'll bring one from this end. And it's just puckering along trail. So it's following my stroke. Do another one along here. And let's go to B for brush, C for cloth. And we can use some other cloth brushes here. I'm a big fan of cloth pinch. So this is another one that gives a nice kind of wrinkle form. So I can run this through here and sort of manually sculpt some nice wrinkling. Let's turn that up. There you go. So it gives us these types of shapes here. And also there is the B for brush, C for cloth, cloth nudge, and cloth pull. I really like cloth pull a lot. I like to just grab these bits and just pull them right up against that collision object. So we get this silky kind of look of a pillow here. So now I want to take all of this and move it down. So I'm going to take my B for brush, or my transpose cloth brush, turn on the pizza box stack, as Pixelogic sometimes calls it, and then I'll just move everybody down. And I'll move everybody down to the ground plane. Now, because it's quite dense, this might actually be a little slow. So what I might want to do is step down my subdivision levels, and then I can move this down and then bump that up against the ground plane, get my displace volume there, and then step my subdivisions back up, and let's give it a nice sort of crimson color. There we go. So that's how we can use inflate with the cloth dynamics to create a pillow upon which the skull or any other object can sit. So it's really nice to realize that you don't even need to run a simulation. You just set up what's going to collide, and then you can use your brushes directly on the cloth object and put it where you want it, and the cloth object will react. So let's take a look now at how we can put a veil across the top of this skull and this pillow together. So here we've got our scene file open with a pillow and a skull. And what we want to do is we want to create a veil or a mantilla that drapes across both of these objects. Now to do that, I'll open up the subtool menu. I will append. Now I can append in a polymesh star and then convert that into a polyplane, or I can just directly import Plane 3D, which is a ZBrush primitive, but as soon as it's imported into a subtool stack, it becomes a PM3D, which means it is a sculptable mesh. So I'll just move this up. Oops, make sure that I've got the plane selected. Move this up, and then I will rotate this around 90 degrees. Like so. If we go into frame mode, you can see we've got a pretty dense mesh, but not too terribly dense. It's 1,000 faces. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to go down here to the Morph Target menu. Now, the Morph Target menu, you most likely have been exposed to Morph Targets already in the course of watching these videos, but just a reminder, Morph Target stores a copy of the mesh in memory. So if I store a Morph Target, change the mesh, and I can switch back between my stored version and the changed version. I'll delete that and store a new one. You can only have one morph target at a time, and the reason we're storing it is because we can use morph targets as a means to help maintain the volume of our mesh. So, you know, my veil right here, maybe I want to scale this out a little bit in the X direction. Move it back just a little bit. Maybe I want this to be the size of that veil were it laid out flat. By storing a morph target of that as I run the simulation and then use my cloth brushes on this mesh, if we have a morph target stored, those brushes will try to reintroduce that volume. So it's an extra little way to try and keep the accuracy of the shape and get more interesting and accurate wrinkles. So we'll store that morph target. and close that menu and come back up here to geometry, go to dynamic subdivision levels, turn on dynamic, and then let's give the mesh some thickness. So we don't want it to get too thick, but we just want to give it a little bit of thickness here. If it's too thick, it'll be awkward when it self-collides. So let's give it just a tiny bit more here. That should be good. Now, let's move this down a little bit so we don't have to fall quite so far for our simulation. Now I'm going to go to the dynamics window, tear this off. We're going to leave our iterations at 100, strength at 1, firmness at 2, leave everything at their default settings, and we are going to turn off frame mode and then run the simulation. And this is what we get. Because we do not have our collision volume, so we need to make sure that we turn on collision volume here. That's going to calculate for the skull, the teeth, and the pillow. Any other subtool in the scene, it's going to calculate as collision objects. So now when I run the simulation, those objects will collide. So there you see it drops down and just grazes the floor. So that's what we get with that. Now, if I were to take one of my cloth brushes, B for brush, C for cloth, and let's say grab cloth hook or cloth pull. So let's grab cloth hook. And then if I just jiggle this brush, and I could turn my Z intensity down a little bit if I feel that that's too strong, and just sort of wiggle this, we can start to get some nice wrinkling here. What's going to happen is it's going to work in tandem with that morph target to try and maintain and return to that original shape, that original, well, not the original shape so much as the original spacing between the edges, which means the original volume, essentially. So this helps us get some nice wrinkles here that actually impact, as I'm wrinkling or wiggling this area, it does impact other parts of the cloth. So we'll pull that out right there where that's just stuck inside that brow. If you have something like this that's stuck, you can wiggle that, or what I like to do is just grab the cloth move brush, B for brush, C for cloth, move cloth, and I can just aggressively boom, pop that right out. Anytime something gets sort of stuck inside of something else, I'll just manually move it like that. So pull this down, and so that's looking pretty good, but we can do better. So I'm going to undo that back to right before the simulation was run, but I don't want to undo all the way back to the point that I undo my subdivision level. So make sure, or not my subdivision level, my morph target. So make sure you don't lose your morph target. Now I am going to turn my simulation iterations all the way up, and I'm going to turn my firmness down to 1. And now we'll run that simulation and look at the difference that we get in the wrinkles in that cloth. Let that run and stop the simulation. Now we're getting much finer wrinkling here. If you look at that, as we start to slide the cloth around, we get a much more silky kind of appearance here. But we're also getting crashing in the cloth. It's crashing into itself. So we don't really want that either. So we'll undo back to just before we run the simulation, and we're going to turn on self-collision. Now, self-collision, the higher you have this, the more accurate the self-collision is going to be. I'll set it to like 1 or 2. That's going to also stiffen the cloth a little bit, and I don't want to do too much of that. So I'll leave that at 1, and now when this makes contact down here, you see we start to get a much, much better result. Let's grab this with the brush, and now as we scoot these bits of cloth around, the cloth is able to collide with itself in a much more natural way. So I'm just going to wiggle these to bunch those up over here. And I'll do the same thing here. I'm just going to grab these and just sort of wiggle the brush and let it bunch up against the skull here. I can run my simulation again and then further adjust. Now I'm going to slide this over, and I can actually bring this down, kind of a creepy sort of veil falling across that skull like so. Now right here I've just got a little problem area. I can literally just smooth that out with a smooth brush and then scoot this back down. We're getting a nice fold. I really like the very realistic and appealing kind of folding and buckling that we're getting in the fabric right here. Now, if I were to turn self-collision up even higher here, let's just turn it all the way up to 4. Look what happens here as I start to sculpt. You see where the cloth is sort of repelling itself. There we go. Where it's bunching up right here. There we go. I can bring this down like so. You can see the difference we get there. Now right here, I'm just going to smooth that a little bit and then wiggle that with the brush. I'll go to B for brush, C for cloth. And right now we're on cloth move. I'll go to the cloth pull brush. That's one of my favorites to use. And if I use cloth pull, just sort of drag this across, it's going to give me this really nice turbulence in those wrinkles that I find really nice. I'm going to take self-collision and bring that back down to 1. There we go, bring these down. Now, if I go to B for brush, C for cloth, there's a real nice brush here that's the cloth twist. So, there we go, cloth twister. This one does literally what it says on the tin. It twists the cloth. And that's really nice if you're just trying to get like maybe the end of a robe, or just any time a cloth sort of rolls or folds over itself, which is something that is going to happen. And it could be hard to sculpt under other circumstances, but here we can just twist that up just like that. Or maybe you're creating sort of a hair wrap and you want that to be able to twist up under itself or over itself. We can bundle that up like so. So I'm going to undo that. Now, let's go back all the way. I'm just going to drag this all the way to the beginning of our simulation because I want to turn up. It's quite cool to watch that in action. There we go. I'm going to turn up my gravity strength now. So with gravity strength all the way up, iterations all the way up, strength all the way up, and firmness all the way down, I am going to run my simulation again. And now that gives that a long sort of, you know, it almost looks like melted cheese. But if I grab, oops, I've still got the twist brush. Let's go to B for brush, C for cloth, and let's do cloth pull. As soon as I grab this brush, it's going to start returning to that original volume. It's remembering that volume because we have that morph target stored. And it's giving us these nice wrinkles running all along the surface of the mesh. So I can drag that veil back. We get this nice little peak right there where it's sort of sticking out from the forehead. We pull this down, and this is just a much, much nicer, more realistic kind of folding here. I want to bunch this up on the side of the head here. And I'm going to bring this over here. Now, what you might find, if we look under here, the cloth isn't laying exactly against the skull. That's because we have an inflate value here, and we also have a resolution for our collision volume. The resolution for the collision volume is how much detail is in the sort of imaginary volume. It's not imaginary, but it's in memory. It's not something we see on screen. ZBrush generates a volume for our collision objects, and the resolution controls how much detail is in that. Inflate controls how much it's inflated off the surface of the actual object. So if I were to reduce this to 0.5, watch what happens. It automatically evaluates volumes again. And now if I take my brush, I can actually move the cloth closer to the surface of the skull because it's not being repelled by that inflated collision object. So I can bring this right down against that temporal bone. You bring this up against the base of the skull here. Let's bring all this down here. And there we go. Now, once again, if I've got this little piece in that's crashing through there, I'm happy just to do B for brush, C for cloth move, and just pull anything like this right out. That's a problem. Because it's a realistic skull, that had to be thin. So if you do have a thin bit of geometry, sometimes something might just get stuck down inside there, and all you have to do is just grab it with a cloth brush and just move it out of the way. So we can use the move cloth, or cloth move, I should say. Sort of scoot this over. And don't neglect, you can also mask your cloth as you're working on it as well. You don't have to work on this unmasked. So here I can make that lay right up into that zygomatic bone there. There we go. So if I want to change this to be a different type of material, maybe I don't want this to just look like this totally flat cloth. Maybe I want this to look like a weave. That's where we can start to use micropoly. So under dynamic subdivisions, we have this micropoly on. If I turn this on, this gives me all these different options. These are just tiles that I can use to replace the polygons of this mesh. So if I were to change this to something like, let's find something that's nice and lacy, like for example this, that changes the cloth into this micropoly object. Now I can still move my cloth around and the micropoly is going to react. So I can treat this like this bit of mesh veil coming down over the head here. So bring this forward. And you can simulate this as well. I could run my simulation on that and it would do the exact same thing. As soon as I touch it with my brush, you can actually see the effect of having that morph target stored, because the mesh, the micropolys appear to stretch there, but as soon as I touch it with the brush, they snap back into their proper proportions. So there we go. That's kind of neat. Now, of course, we could change this to any number of other bits here. We could go over and we could change this to this chainmail, which has its own bit of charm to be draped over a skull like that. So we move this back. There we go. Maybe pull this back. Now we could change this again. Let's say we want to make this into, oops, there we go. This knit. So we have a knit like this. Now we have a scale control here. If I change the scale, I can adjust the sizing like this. There we go. If we turn on align, we can change the alignment. We can also rotate it. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the nanomesh. And we can rotate B like that. So let's go ahead and change to a different piece here. We can go to this cross knit, which has its own nice look. That's the one that I used originally for the veil that it's on my, my skull demo image. So bring this back, bring this down. There we go. Now, if I want to make this into actual geometry, because this is still just a dynamic subdivision, what I'll do is I will click apply, and then that has turned this into actual geometry. If I go into frame mode, that's real geometry right there. So we go back to here, solo this, there you can see that's actual geo. If I were to control D, I could divide that. So this has now been baked down into an actual bit of geometry. So I'm going to turn off frame mode and turn off solo. So that's how we can use cloth to create a veil similar to the one that I did in the demo image I showed at the beginning. It's obviously, you know, a really powerful and awesome tool set. There are some other things that we can do with it in a later chapter in NanoMesh. I'll show you how you can simulate hard surfaces by using cloth dynamics with NanoMesh. So there's lots of creative ways that you can work with this. You can use it to create cloth, you can use it to create skin, you can use it to create slime and drool. There's really no limit to what you can do with it beyond just making cloth and costumes. Also, you can use the cloth brushes to sculpt on skin. So you can sculpt something with like droopy jowls, like a hound dog. Some of those cloth brushes work really well when you're working on skin. So that's our look at cloth in ZBrush 2021. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.